Good Monday morning of the 28th week in Ordinary Time. It begins with October 10th. And so we're well into October when we're beginning that. By the way, you see my sweatshirt? My Alaska sweatshirt. Friends gave it to me from Alaska. Anyway, just instead of wearing my Bill Ritchie sweatshirt, which is from Ontario, I'm switching to Alaska. Okay, you see some of my friends in Alaska watch these videos. You know, it's interesting. Today's readings and tomorrow from the letter to the Galatians. That's a tricky letter. I don't think I just read a commentary and I didn't find it all that helpful, to tell you the truth. But in this sense, St. Paul, let me just say this in the background, okay? St. Paul, in almost all his writings, is dealing with a powerful influence within the life of the church, the early church, and that is the church's ability to recognize itself, especially amongst his Gentile Christians, as not being under Jewish law, that we are not Jews. If anything that St. Paul did in all his preaching was to clearly establish that we are not under the Jewish law, and therefore we are not Jews. You see, and that Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism, but it is not subordinate to Judaism. Christ fulfills the law. Christ fulfills the law. He is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise and the completion of the Mosaic law. Christ is the fulfillment of the entire Old Testament come to fruition in his life and especially his death on the cross, the Paschal Lamb. He is the final Paschal Lamb, the final exodus from the slavery of death and sin to eternal life, okay, and sanctity, okay? So that's the architectonic of Paul's writing. But also within it is the temptation, the constant temptation to go back to the ancient law, especially by the Jewish Christians. Paul tells us we are called to freedom, okay? But the temptation is to seek the security of law. And here the Jewish law was seen the safest of all laws, you see? Freedom is, how can I put it right, is freedom is scary because it requires that we have a trust in the person of God and not in the rigorism of the fulfillment of law, the fulfillment of the filling out and the fulfilling of mandates, contracts. I'm not saying any of that well this morning, I'm sorry. But we're more comfortable in obeying rules than we are in the freedom of love, especially in matters of religion, because if we're fulfilling the rules, we're safe. And Christ doesn't call us to safety, he calls us to freedom. It could be the freedom that leads to martyrdom. It takes us away from the security of order into the freedom of the children of God, the daring freedom, the wild freedom of God himself, you see. But the temptation to seek after and want to subordinate oneself to a structured life, a life of law, especially if it's biblical law, it's built in. Paul resisted. He fought it because he saw you're subordinating yourself to something that has already been fulfilled. It's obsolete. He uses those actual words. The law is obsolete. It's done. The game is over. It's been fulfilled. So, see? But I think too, though, it's my birthday this week on the 11th. So I've been really kind of reflecting on my past. I talked to some very old friends this week. My old friend Barbara Gustinelli, she lives in California now with her family. You know, it's been quite a few years since I've seen her, but it just reflecting on the past, the people of my past, living and dead. It's time of the year, I guess, the fall of the year, as you go from the warmth and the full flourishing of the green summer to the beautiful colors of a dying fall, whatever you want to call it. And it's a reflective time. And I think I feel that very strongly right now. But I remember the past. I remember the years in the past, how we were so restricted by the way the church functioned prior to the council, the Second Vatican Council, the church of the 50s, which was so law-like. It was so strict and so legalistic, especially in the confessional. We have codified so many sins, both mortal and venial. It was the rule of canon law versus the gospel. And it was hard to have a sense of the boldness of the freedom of God, the love of God. It seemed so remote. What we were aware of was the judgment of God and his condemnation and the avoidance of an eternal hell. And I'm sorry, that's the truth. That's exactly what St. Paul was attacking, is that mindset. But we recuperated it with a vengeance in the church of the, I don't know how far back it went, but for sure it was the first half of the 20th century. And I remember as I went into very, very scrupulous, I was condemned to scrupulosity. I saw sins everywhere. Now, I don't think I was that different than anyone else. The confessionals were used to have 20 people in line to go every Sunday, every Saturday. Maybe multiple lines, 3 or 4 confessors hearing all the sins. Most of the sins were probably venial, occasionally something serious. But we lived with a strenuous, what's the word, a strident conscience. A conscience rooted in fear, the fear of hell damnation, you see. And then the council came and it rejected all that imagery. It didn't reject law, but the subservience to law, and talked about the love of Christ. And at that time, by the time of the council, I was in the Passion. I was a member of the community. And I can remember the enormous influence that the Passionist preachers had on me and my confessors, because they were steeped in the wisdom of the cross, not in the coercive fears that came from law. And they lifted that burden off of me. Sometimes they had to give me a kick in the rear to make it happen because I was so scrupulous. So scrupulous. But my confessors weren't, and they did not encourage scrupulosity. They were passionists. They were contemplating the suffering Christ on the cross, who died for love of us, not out of canonical laws and rules, but out of freedom and the wild freedom of love itself. And as a passionist, I finally embraced the love of Christ and not the fear of Christ, the love of Christ. And it radically transformed my whole spirituality. I have to say that. I learned to love Christ and to trust him, because I learned that the love of God for me is it's analogous to my father and mother's love for me. That's how I saw it. I began to realize that this love was a faithful love, that God loved me with the fidelity of a parent, Christ as the fidelity of a brother. See? I don't know if the right words. That was transformative for me. I stopped being afraid. If I feared anything, I feared not that God would condemn me, that I would not live worthily, of the love he had for me. But I have that same attitude toward my family. When I left home, my father and mother, they said something: never dishonor our family. Simple. Do whatever you want, but don't dishonor the family. And I hope I have never dishonored the cross of Christ. I hope I have always served the church that I've been called to serve with fidelity and love. See? As Christ loved us and commissioned me to do that. Like the Apostle Paul. We're all apostles. We're called to bring Christ to the world. Which Christ? A crucified Christ. Not a judgment Christ, not a God, a Lord with lightning bolts flying from his hands, but the tenderness of a wounded hand bleeding for me. The images I had of God in the 50s was he was throwing lightning bolts around. Christ was throwing lightning bolts. A Christ of terror. Instead, I see a wounded Christ who bleeds from his hands and his side and his feet. I'm not being pious. A crucified Christ who loves me. Now, I do not fear Christ. I only fear I won't be faithful enough to him and the church he gave me to serve as best I can. Now, that's the truth. I love St. Paul. St. Paul and the Passionists. The Passionists brought me to St. Paul. They taught me St. Paul, and they taught me by their preaching. They taught me the wisdom of the cross.